On June 3rd, 1942, nine B-17 bombers that had taken off from Midway Island made a largely ineffectual attack upon a group of Japanese transports. And those were the first shots in the pivotal Battle of Midway. And while the battle at Midway is one of the most well known and discussed battles of the Pacific War, much less known is that at the exact same time, another Japanese carrier group was attacking another U.S. held Pacific island, 1,800 miles away. The Japanese attack on the U.S. bases at Dutch Harbor on the Aleutian island of Amanak deserve to be remembered. The U.S. Aleutian Islands, including 14 major islands and 55 smaller islands, in their entirety encompass some 8,600 square miles of landmass along a more than 1,200-mile-long archipelago. The island chain is so long that it crosses the 180th meridian, which would put the westernmost islands across the international date line were the line not deliberately adjusted around them. The islands were initially claimed in the early 18th century by Imperial Russia by Vitus Bering, the subject of another episode of the History Guy. The islands became U.S. territory when the U.S. purchased Alaska in 1867. The largest town in the chain is Unalaska, which sits on both Unalaska Island and tiny nearby Amanak Island. As many as 1,000 Aleut people lived on the two islands when the first Russian traders arrived in 1759. Amanak includes a natural deep-water harbor on its south side that, according to an unsubstantiated story, was first visited by a Dutch ship. Thus, the Russians, who used the harbor at least since the 1760s, named the harbor Dutch Harbor. After the U.S. purchase, the island continued to be a trading station and a waypoint for men trying to reach the Klondike goldfields. According to an historical overview by the U.S. National Park Service, the U.S. military built its first installation, a Navy radio station, at Dutch Harbor in 1911. But in the face of Japanese expansion in the Pacific, in 1938 a naval board was appointed to recommend additional bases. Among the recommendations was submarine and seaplane bases at Dutch Harbor. Congress approved the recommendation, and a naval operating base and air station was constructed, along with an Army base to house the men tasked with the naval base's protection. Much of the island was already public domain, but the Navy purchased 127 acres from the Northern Commercial Company for $73,478. The Park Service explains, at Dutch Harbor, the Naval Section Base was commissioned in January 1941, and the Naval Air Station that September. The first Army troops arrived at Amanak on May 8, 1941. The Army post, established at Margaret Bay, south of Dutch Harbor, was completed September 10, 1941, and named Fort Mears in honor of Colonel Frederick Mears, who had been instrumental in surveying and building the Alaska Railroad. The Park Service history reports. The troops noted the village of Unalaska on the main island, saying that it had a population of 50 whites and 250 Aleuts, and there was also a body house having a population of 1 madam and 5 girls. The Naval Air Station included facilities for seaplanes, but also an emergency airfield that could be used for fighter planes that was so short, the Park Service writes, that it included arresting and catapult gear, similar to an aircraft carrier's. Construction of the base was still ongoing in June of 1942, but the island and the only U.S. military installations on the Aleutian Islands were already in the crosshairs of Imperial Japan. The website Together We Served explains, the Aleutian Islands are known for their rugged, treeless tundra and almost perpetually foul weather, but during the early days of World War II they were considered a valuable piece of real estate. Fresh off their success at Pearl Harbor, the Japanese were looking to consolidate their gains in the Pacific, while also stymieing any potential U.S. attacks against their home islands. The Aleutians, situated at the center of the shortest route between the United States and Japan, were viewed as a key part of their defensive shield. While the bulk of their navy looked to demolish the American Pacific Fleet at the Battle of Midway, a smaller force, consisting of 2 aircraft carriers and a handful of destroyers, cruisers, and submarines, sailed for the frozen north. The Japanese fleet, under the command of Rear Admiral Kakuji Kakuta, included the aircraft carrier Junyo and the light aircraft carrier Ryujo, carrying together some 86 aircraft, accompanied by 3 cruisers and 5 destroyers. The attack was timed to coincide with the attack on Midway Island, perhaps as a diversion. A 1945 Office of Naval Intelligence report explains, while the eventual goal of the Japanese activities in the Aleutians remains somewhat obscure, it is clear that the initial attack in June 1942 was subsidiary to the powerful thrust at Midway. The Central Pacific Offensive was conducted by approximately 80 ships, including 4 or 5 carriers, at least 3 battleships, and a large number of cruisers, destroyers, auxiliaries, and transports. The simultaneous assault on the Aleutians employed a much smaller force, probably containing 2 small carriers, 2 seaplane tenders, several heavy and light cruisers, destroyers, and submarines belonging to the Fifth Fleet, and from 4 to 6 transports and cargo vessels. Obviously, Midway was the primary objective. The U.S. preparation in the Aleutian Islands at the time was limited. A task force under the command of Rear Admiral Robert A. Fuzzy Theobald had only been created on May 21st, tasked with defending the entirety of the Alaska-Aleutian theater. The Naval Intelligence Report lamented the inadequacy of the strength available, which included only 52 vessels and 169 planes. It included 2 heavy and 3 light cruisers, 11 destroyers, 6 submarines, 2 destroyer seaplane tenders, 1 gunboat, 1 minesweeper, 2 oilers, 10 Coast Guard vessels, and 14 district patrol craft. Planes, mostly Army types, consisted of 94 fighters, 7 4-motored bombers, 4 2-motored bombers, 23 patrol bombers, and 3 scouts. The Naval Intelligence Report writes Admiral Theobald's force was not only pitifully small, but it had to be spread dangerously thin. Nevertheless, our situation at the time was such that no significant reinforcements could be assigned, although the area to be protected constituted one of the most important approaches to the United States. Theobald had no carriers assigned to him, making air operations difficult. Together we served explains that planes deemed obsolete elsewhere were sent north, including B-18s, essentially a DC-3 prototype fitted with drop bombs. Historian John Clow notes the military didn't want the clunkers, but Congress bought them anyway. There were a number of seaplanes, good for scouting oceans, but flying coffins in combat. If a PBY could carry bombs and guns, but with a cruising speed of 125 miles an hour, they seemed to be sitting still while challenged by a Zero coming in at 300 miles an hour. But Theobald did have one ace up his sleeve. The Army possessed a base at Fort Glenn on Umnak Island, just 68 miles from Unalaska, which had been constructed in such deep secrecy that it was believed to be unknown to the enemy. 12 P-40s were stationed there. Naval intelligence had broken the Japanese naval codes, and by the end of May, the Naval Intelligence Report explained, intelligence had made it clear that a Japanese attack could be expected during the first few days of June, probably in the Umnak, Dutch Harbor, Cold Bay area, and U.S. and Canadian forces throughout the theater were on 24-hour alert. As many planes as possible were moved to forward bases, and 2 destroyers, the Clinton-class USS King and the Wicks-class USS Talbot, were in Dutch Harbor, as well as the seaplane tender USS Gillis, the Coast Guard cutter Onondaga, and 2 Army transports. The harbor's air defenses were provided by the 206th Coast Artillery, an anti-aircraft unit of the Arkansas National Guard. Their presence there was a matter of chance. In his 1992 book, The Arkansas National Guard in the Aleutians in World War II, Donald Goldstein writes that in July of 1941, for some time a rumor had been circulated that there would be a coin toss as to who would be going where. That is precisely what happened. Colonel Robertson of the 206th flipped a coin with the commander of the 200th Coastal Artillery to determine which unit would go to the Philippines and which to the Aleutians. A disappointed Sergeant Massey wrote, "We lost the toss. Our hearts were heavy with disappointment." Little could they know that what was anticipated to be a 4-month deployment would end up being extended through the duration of a war that hadn't yet started. Moreover, Goldstein writes, lacking the gift of prophecy, they could not foresee that as a result of their friendly coin toss, the 200th would suffer horribly and be decimated in the Philippines. The 206th shipped out for Alaska on August 1st. The website of the U.S. National Guard writes that the 206th was armed with obsolescent 3-inch anti-aircraft guns and water-cooled 50-caliber machine guns. The defenses included other units as well, including elements of the 250th Coast Artillery, a California National Guard unit armed with 150mm guns, tasked with defending the harbor from enemy warships, as well as men of the 37th Infantry Regiment and the 151st Engineer Regiment of the Alaska Territorial Guard. Kakuta's planes began their first attack the morning of June 3rd. Together we served writes, starting at 3:25 a.m. on June 3rd, warplanes took off from the carriers Ryuko and Junyo, Val dive bombers, Kate torpedo bombers, Zero fighters. The weather turned many back, but those that continued found clear skies between them and the 6,282 soldiers below. The Office of Naval Intelligence writes, ashore, the Naval Air Station had gone to general quarters at 04:30 in accordance with daily routine. At 5:45, while battle stations were still fully manned, a flight of about 15 carrier-type fighter planes appeared. Any doubt as their enemy character disappeared when they began to strafe our installations, and our batteries opened up an intense anti-aircraft fire. After a single flight over the station, during which they did very little damage, the planes moved off to the northward. The National World War II Museum writes, in the early morning hours of June 3, 1942, Lieutenant John Gaines was at his quarters, doing his best to keep warm. Even though it was June, the overnight temperature in western Alaska and the eastern Aleutians typically hovered around 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Gaines, a battery commander in the 250th Coast Artillery Regiment, was about to crawl into his cot for a few minutes of sleep when he heard the sound of explosions outside. Gaines immediately ran outside and made his way to his battery command post on the ridge overlooking Dutch Harbor. On his way there, he could see Japanese planes attacking the naval air station across the harbor. By the time Gaines got to his CP, his gun crews were already at their stations, their 155mm guns pointing out into Iluluk Bay past the harbor entrance, ready to engage any enemy warship or surface submarine that might come within range. As author Brian Garfield termed it, the 1,000-mile war had begun. Gus Stravos, commanding officer of the Naval Armed Guard Detachment on the Army Transport SS President Fillmore, reported enemy planes were sighted. Visibility was excellent, inasmuch as at the hour in the land of the midnight sun we were favored with a clear Arctic sky. Tojo came over in formations of 3 and 4 planes, totaling 19 bombers and fighters, and generally followed the same tactics that he used at Pearl Harbor, i.e. squadrons approaching from the south and west simultaneously, flying straight and level, crossing, turning, and coming back from the north and east. The air defense was spirited. Goldstein quotes Sergeant James Massey of the 206th Battery G. I was jolted awake by one of my men, Hal Duncan. Here they come up, boys. Everyone hit their positions. I could hear the whine of the plane engine somewhere. I shoved the ammo clip, loading the 37. Just then a flash came around the west side of the Ballyhoo Mountain, a Zero bearing down on the Navy's runway target. I remember saying to the gunner, "Shoot, damn it, shoot!" The Zero turned away. There was confusion, with some fearing that they were shooting at friendly planes. Goldstein writes that Sergeant Gruner of Battery B received orders by phone to cease fire. They were friendly planes. At about that time, a bomb dropped nearby. Friendly planes don't drop bombs, remarked Gruner grimly. Fire the gun. Goldstein opines that the ceasefire order argues a high degree of naivete under the circumstances, plus a low degree of skill in aircraft recognition on somebody's part. The Naval Intelligence Report writes that the ships had joined the shore batteries in firing at the planes. The commander of the Naval Air Station remarked that the President Fillmore's fire was notable. In addition to her own armament, she mounted on deck a battery of 37mm guns, consigned to Cold Bay, which gave her 22 anti-aircraft guns. These were served with such rapidity that the Fillmore appeared to be, and was reported to be, on fire. But despite their action, it's unclear how much damage the 206 was doing. Sergeant Oliver Rainey of Battery F observed that the Zeros flew so low that the AA was useless because the guns couldn't be depressed to an angle lower than 15 degrees. Corporal Thomas O'Neill of Battery A reported a plane flying so low that he shot at it with his rifle, although he doubted if he hit the target. The World War II Museum writes that the initial attack on Dutch Harbor on June 3, 1942 was unorganized and caused little damage. The Office of Naval Intelligence writes that they released 16 bombs. 2 dropped in the water, but 14 fell in the congested area of Fort Mears, the white frame buildings of which made a conspicuous target. 2 barracks and 3 Quonset huts were destroyed, and several buildings were damaged by the hits and resulting fire. The website Circle to Circle writes that 17 men of the 37th Infantry and 8 from the 151st Engineers died when a bomb exploded at a barracks at Fort Mears, with the Office of Naval Intelligence writing the same number wounded. Sadly, most of those killed had just arrived on the President Fillmore the day before. A third attack, the Naval Intelligence Report writes, apparently had as its target the wooden oil tanks, which had been there for years, so that the enemy could easily have known their location. The bombs overshot the tanks, but killed a man in a Navy fire watcher's pillbox and the driver of an Army truck. All told, about 15 fighters and 13 horizontal bombers participated in the raid. Bombs were also falling on the town. Goldstein writes that Nurse Martha Tekiakov gave the alarm and evacuated the native hospital. A wing of the hospital was destroyed. Missing was American air support. Together We Served writes that Dutch Harbor's defenders were handicapped by radio and radar problems. The closest air support at Umnak Island remained unaware of the attack until it was over. Planes based at Cold Bay heard the news but were too far away to get there on time. The Naval Intelligence Report writes no fighters from Fort Glenn, 65 miles away, managed to intercept. Further attacks came the second day. The Park Service writes Japanese planes dropped approximately 70 bombs, causing damage to several buildings, ships, and military equipment. They hit a 3,000-ton SS Northwestern, a beached vessel near Dutch Harbor that served as a housing for civilian workers. The vessel caught fire and was destroyed. 4 new steel fuel tanks and 22,000 barrels of oil, a month's supply for Dutch Harbor, were also destroyed. Finally, the Army planes got involved. The Naval Intelligence Report writes, coincident with the second Dutch Harbor raid, Japanese fighters strafed shore installations at Fort Glenn on Umnak. Army pursuit planes took to the air and shot down 2 enemy aircraft. Together We Served writes, the ensuing dogfight took a toll on both sides, but the bulk of the Japanese force made it back to the carriers. The planes were stowed below and the fleet steered back into the fog. The Naval Intelligence Report writes, the 3 Japanese attacks on 3 and 4 June constituted the enemy's sole offensive action in the central and eastern Aleutians in the entire period of the campaign. But it was not the last conflict in the theater. The National World War II Museum writes, 2 days after the attack on Dutch Harbor, Japanese troops landed on and occupied the western Aleutian islands of Kiska and Attu. The Battle of Dutch Island had cost 43 Americans killed and another 50 wounded, with significant damage to the base and a loss of 14 aircraft. Japanese losses were 8 planes destroyed, for a loss of 8 pilots killed and 5 captured. How important was the brief Battle of Dutch Harbor? Together We Served notes, notwithstanding the tragic loss of American lives, the first 48 hours of the Aleutian campaign exacted little substantive damage on U.S. or Japanese forces. No Japanese vessels were damaged, and the fort at Dutch Harbor was quickly repaired. Moreover, while the attack was reported, the public got few details. Together We Served writes, given that American soil was attacked directly by the Japanese, and this was seen as a demoralizing factor, the military clamped down on any news reporting of the event. Little was known at the time in the lower 48 about this attack on Dutch Harbor. Still, the attack had important and unexpected impacts. The attack was a disaster for Alaska's native peoples. The National Park Service writes, the bombing of Dutch Harbor created enormous consequences for indigenous residents of the Aleutian Islands. The U.S. government, assuming responsibility for the care and management of Alaska natives, decided to evacuate all the Ununag people from the Aleutian Islands following the bombing. While the decision was ostensibly made for the Ununag people's safety, the reality of their experience was shaped by prejudice and mistreatment. Evacuees were sent to makeshift evacuation camps in dilapidated canneries, a camp built by the Civilian Conservation Corps, and even an abandoned gold mine in southeastern Alaska. There, Ununag evacuees struggled with disease, shelter, food, and access to their traditional ways of life while being completely neglected by the government. An estimated 10% of Ununag evacuees died under the government's care during this time. But the effect was perhaps the opposite for the state's modern economy. Together We Served writes, when those bombs fell, they brought not just destruction, but the seeds of coming prosperity. The war in Alaska turned serious, and the haphazard backwater afterthought, a dumping ground for old equipment and token commands, was suddenly transformed into a fortress and major depot as big and modern and efficient as military planners could make it. That status grew as the threat from Japan ended and the threat from the Soviet Union emerged. Military spending replaced the gold, coal, and fur that had sustained Alaska before the war, ushering in 2 booming decades that would see the territory to statehood and keep it growing until oil became the state's major economic engine. And there was one significant military effect. The Japanese A6M-0 had proven devastating to American fighter aircraft at the outset of the war. While some had been shot down, they had been so wrecked that little was learned from them. Goldstein writes, following the attack, 19-year-old Flight Petty Officer First Class Tadayoshi Koga radioed his flight leader that his plane was losing gasoline and didn't have sufficient fuel to make it back to Ryujo. Koga attempted instead to land at Akutan Island, which Goldstein writes the Japanese had designated as an emergency landing site. The plane flipped over as he tried to land it, killing Koga. His A6M, nearly intact, was later discovered by a Catalina PBY crew. Testing of the Akutan-0 revealed weaknesses that could be exploited by Allied pilots. While the military censored most of the details, the attack was reported on in the United States, and yet the Battle of Dutch Harbor remains largely unknown. Clough argues that the battle was simply overshadowed by the larger events that followed. In fact, the entire Aleutian Islands campaign can be seen as a largely overlooked part of the largest war in human history. But the people who fought there deserve to be remembered. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop, book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.